Again. Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I'm pleased to introduce Stephen Platek as the editor, or one of the editors, of the Mind section of Evolution, This View of Life. And the other editor will be Steve's wife, Austin Krill. Is that right, Stephen?
That's correct.
And we will have a separate interview with her. It gives me special pleasure to have a husband-wife team as the editors, because I'm also married to an academic spouse, and so welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, David. This is a really exciting project, and I'm super excited to be part of it.
Thank you very much. So tell us a little bit about how you got involved with evolution as a psychologist, and then we'll talk a little bit about your work.
Sure. As a child, I've always been interested in animal behavior, and was fortunate enough to have books like The Origin of Species, The Naked Ape, kind of laying around my house, always very driven by inquiry. When I went to Rutgers for undergraduate in psychology, they kind of poo-pooed on evolutionary psychology at the campus I was at. And that drove me to want to know why. And in some classes, I got the bit about sociobiology, and it had about 6 lines in the textbook, and so we should just ignore that.
What year was this?
Come on, David. So I graduated from Rutgers in 1998, so okay. This is in late 90s.
Good, okay.
And it was very unfortunate. So it drove me into conversations with my faculty members and other students about why are humans exempt from evolution. And then ultimately I went to graduate school with Gordon Gallup, and it was just a match made in heaven, to be quite honest. It was just the idea that humans were special always felt uncomfortable to me. I didn't come from a particularly religious family. We weren't particularly academic either, but there was no overpowering ideas about the creation or how humans came to be. And we just always assumed that, or discussed, that humans were just part of the animal kingdom, and humans do crazy things, and we would watch the news and talk about, well, it's similar to how the dogs act and that sort of thing. And so it's just kind of been rewarded or reinforced through my development that animals humans are animals. And when I became interested in psychology, it just was a natural step to start thinking about the evolution of the mind and how, basically, the big question is how the brain is working, and then sort of why the brain works in the way it does with respect to these these ultimate questions of causation.
Cool. And then you did and then a little bit more about your career. What happened next?
Yeah, so I got my PhD from Albany State. I moved to Drexel University. Drexel University in Philadelphia is it was at the time a completely clinical program. So you can imagine the difficulty I had trying to convince clinical students that evolution is important. I tried my best. Ultimately, Robin Dunbar's group in the University of Liverpool was hiring for an evolutionary psychologist, applied, got hired, which was fortunate because Austin got accepted for her PhD program there, so she got her PhD from Liverpool, and was able to do a lot of really cool work because I had open access to some MRI scanners and ask questions like, what is happening in the brain when we do tasks that evolutionary psychologists do on an everyday basis? So as an example, I think some of the most common research in evolutionary psychology is this facial attractiveness or this waist to hip ratio stuff. And the idea that we have these evolved psychological mechanisms, you can read an evolutionary psychology textbook about these evolved modules or these input-output mechanisms and what have you, and they're still all relatively theoretical, although the authors pitch them as if there's a neurobiological correlate to something without any neurobiological evidence. And so that really, as a burgeoning neuroscientist, made me quite, honestly, it made me quite upset, because my take in science and the way that I was taught about science is that you don't just go saying things without the evidence. So So it was always my take to take these claims that there was some kind of mechanism in the brain, there was some proximate module or process. And so I started doing research on facial attractiveness, on social interactions, and then ultimately on sort of body attractiveness and interactions, and began finding some interesting and yet not surprising data about the evolved cognitive mechanisms and the proximate causation. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there are some generalist mechanisms. And, you know, what is rewarding for you to drink a cup of coffee or chocolate milk is about the same part of the brain that's rewarding when you look at a hot girl. That's not surprising. There shouldn't be a part of the brain for hot girls. So we're starting to outline those kinds of ideas in neuroscience and take what I think is being pitched in evolutionary psychology and perhaps misunderstood, I'm not going to say overstated, but misunderstood by some students as if there's these little blobs or modules in the brain.
Well, this is a favorite theme of mine, and it's one that I certainly look forward to discussing on evolution, um, uh, this view of life, and has to do with massive modularity. It has to do with a particular conception that became associated with evolutionary psychology, um, um, centered around the work of Cosmides and Tooby, and which should be thought of as a school of thought,
Absolutely.
and among other schools of thought. And it got some things right, it got some things wrong, and we're sorting that out. That's no shame. That's not the collapse of evolutionary psychology. That's progress. So, and I think that I'm very excited about a broader form of evolutionary psychology, which includes an open-ended, domain general component. I think that's going to be very unifying, and the fact that that's going to include the mechanistic level all the way down to neurobiology, in addition to the kind of the middle levels of cognitive psychology and so on, and of course all leading to a phenotype. That's what this is going to be all about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, evolutionary psychology, unfortunately, is falling victim, I think, to what psychology falls victim to, which is this inferiority complex. So evolutionary psychology came about with this massive modularity and this big school of thought that was very popular. And it's almost as if any other school of thought now is that's not the right one. That can't be right. So as an example, when I was taught about evolutionary psychology, there was a huge impression that group selection or various levels of selection, that's not how it works. All gene centered. And as I mature as a scientist, starting to think about more of these multi-level analyses for selection. And so the whole idea is that it's another school of thought and it's a process. And the fact that there's controversy between those two schools of thought is really what excites me about science. If there's no controversy and there's no disagreement, then we've answered the question and maybe we should move on. But the fact is we haven't answered the questions. And
yeah, and one of the most tragic things about the creationist debate is that in a kind of a defensive response to it, some evolutionists have thought it's very important to present evolution as fact, which is not what science is about. Evolution, I mean, of course, evolution does generate facts, but to kind of hide the disagreement that takes place amongst evolutionists is the opposite of what we're going to do. We're going to put the disagreement among evolutionists on full display.
yeah.
And we'll see. And science does that in a disciplined fashion. I like to think of science as people disagreeing in a principled way. And of course, that only happens sometimes. So I'm sure
Right.
what's going to happen is scientists disagreeing with each other in an unprincipled way. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Exactly.
I wanted to have you talk a little bit with you about exercise and diet from an evolutionary perspective, because this is something that I know that you do at a personal level. I want to hear about that. And then I want to just touch upon how you and me are going to go about doing this at a scientific level, something which I look forward to reporting upon on in Evolution, This View of Life. So tell us a little bit about diet and exercise.
Sure, excellent. Been an athlete my whole life, college hockey, the whole deal. And so it's been a big interest of mine, being fit and having the best, you know, the best fuel in the tank. And as I started studying evolution, and one of the things that I have to say, and it really inspired me, was the Evolutionary Studies Consortium. This idea that there's this designed diet, this agricultural revolution that, while we are adapting and potentially very rapidly adapting to what's happened after the agricultural evolution, which is several hundreds and thousands of generations, we do have this baseline evolved adaptation for eating certain types of things. And so, for example, people who can tolerate milk, very small percentage of the world's population. So maybe there's something in there. And so what we've been trying to do on a personal level, my wife and I, is just